Under the fading sun of an Oregon outpost in 1869, the air was thick with dust, pine sap, and the restless murmur of men who had long forgotten tenderness. A makeshift platform of wooden crates creaked beneath the weight of a young woman whose presence stirred both hunger and hostility. A rough burlap sack was pulled tightly over her head, the coarse fibers brushing her lips, her breath shallow and uneven beneath its suffocating weave. The crowd's jeers bit into the silence like knives, spitting laughter that reduced her existence to a cruel spectacle. The thin fabric of her faded dress clung to her damp skin, tracing the curve of her body in a way that made her vulnerability almost unbearable to witness. And yet, within the trembling stillness of her stance, there was an unspoken strength, like a flame refusing to die even as the storm closed in. $2 for a corpse! A man barked, his voice raw with scorn, his spit landing in the dirt as others laughed. The voices collided, a filthy tide of greed that drowned out decency. But then came the sound of deliberate footsteps cutting through the noise. Boots crushed the earth with a certainty that silenced even the cruelest laughter. Caleb Holt emerged from the crowd, his broad shoulders framed beneath a worn coat, his black hat casting a shadow across his weathered face. Years of chopping timber had left his hands rough, scarred, yet steady, the kind of hands that built, protected, endured. His voice, low and sharp as a blade slicing through wind, cut the air. $2, he said, not with mockery, not with lust, but with finality. The auctioneer faltered, blinking at the unexpected challenge, while the crowd muttered in disbelief. Caleb's gaze never wavered. He didn't need to see her face. The trembling of her body, the silent courage in her stillness was enough. "I'm marrying a woman, not a face," he declared, his tone heavy, unyielding. The world seemed to pause. The burlap shifted faintly, as if the woman beneath it had drawn a deeper breath, a small spark of defiance flickering. Her voice slipped through, soft yet steady. Clara Wren. That single name cracked something open in Caleb's memory. A snowbound cave, the glow of firelight, a pair of hands that had once kept him alive when death prowled close. Desire, confusion, and recognition twisted inside him, leaving him raw, unmoored. Had fate brought back a ghost, wrapped in burlap and fear, to test the weight of his promises and the depths of his heart? He stepped forward, claimed her hand, and led her from the platform, the murmurs of the crowd fading into the background. Each step away from the outpost was like walking into another world, a world of pine forests and shadows, of whispers in the wind that carried both danger and hope. Clara's bare feet pressed against the earth, steady despite the twine still binding her wrists. The burlap sack swayed with her every breath, revealing glimpses of her chin, her trembling lips. Caleb's jaw tightened as his eyes drifted, unwilling yet unable to resist the sight of her form moving beside him. He snapped his gaze to the trail, silently chastising himself, his wife's memory pressing against his heart like a vow carved in stone. The forest welcomed them, branches closing above like a cathedral of green. Behind them, the outpost's cruel laughter dissolved into the rustle of leaves and the low murmur of a river. The mule followed with its rattling cargo, sacks of flour and salt swaying gently as the cabin came into view, braced against the rocky rise of land. A rusted horseshoe above the door marked it as a place of shelter, if not of joy. Caleb pushed the door open, its hinges groaning as though releasing secrets long held. "You stand where you choose," he said, his voice rough as timber split by an axe. "No one places you now." The words, simple and firm, carried something healing in their weight, like a promise that freedom, however fragile, had returned to her life. Clara stepped inside slowly, her fingers grazing the smooth floorboards, her movements cautious yet deliberate. She crouched by the far wall, her knees drawn up, the sack fluttering faintly with each exhale. Caleb busied himself at the stove, clanking iron, filling the air with the warmth of simmering broth and the faint sweetness of cinnamon. He set a wooden bowl near her and stepped back, giving her space. He asked nothing, demanded nothing, only let the silence be filled by the crackle of firelight. Her fingers hesitated on the sack's frayed edge. Slowly, carefully, she lifted it just enough to see the steam rising from the bowl. A dark strand of hair slipped free, brushing against her jaw, kissed by the golden glow of the flames. "Why 2 bowls?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the trembling strength of someone who had lived half-hidden for too long. Caleb stirred his own meal, his knuckles whitening around the spoon. "For my wife," he said, the words rasping from his chest. "After the war, for coming home alive, and now, for you." The admission fractured something inside him, letting in light and sorrow in equal measure. Clara's lips parted beneath the sack, a sound escaping her throat that was almost a laugh, almost a sob. She guided the spoon slowly, deliberately, as though each bite was more than food. It was trust, tentative and fragile. Caleb kept his eyes on the fire, yet her presence filled the cabin with a warmth he had long believed lost. The memory of the cave burned brighter, of the woman's hands keeping him alive when the storm would have taken him. He wanted to ask, to reach across the silence and demand the truth. Was she the one? But the words lodged in his throat, trapped between fear and yearning. Outside, the forest whispered of storms yet to come. The river hummed its endless song. Inside, 2 souls sat in fragile silence, stitched together by fate, secrets, and a fire that refused to die. Caleb stepped out into the cold night after the meal, the stars sharp above the trees, the ache in his chest, a weight he could no longer name. He was bound to her now, this woman with a hidden face and a voice that stirred the ghosts of his heart. What shadows followed her? And why did his soul, chained to the memory of another, begin to stir for her? If this story touches even a small place in your heart, if you find yourself drawn into the healing fire of their fragile beginning, I invite you to let me know with a gentle like, a comment that shares your thoughts, and a kind subscription that helps these stories keep breathing. Every gesture, no matter how small, is a seed of light planted in dark soil. Your presence here keeps the trail alive, carrying love and redemption forward into the chapters yet unwritten. And as spring unfolded over the Oregon pines, the air heavy with wildflowers, their journey into silence and secrets was only beginning. The path ahead promising both danger and the tender ache of love not yet spoken. The cabin settled into a quiet rhythm in the days that followed, its walls breathing with the warmth of the fire and the hush of the forest pressing close beyond the windows. Clara moved within its shadows like a ghost, learning again how to be flesh and blood. She carried herself carefully, the burlap sack still draped over her head, though now it hung more loosely, as if she was testing the edges of trust with each breath she took. Caleb gave her space, never once demanding she reveal what she wasn't ready to show. Instead, he kept to his chores, the splitting of logs, the fetching of water, the mending of tools, with the steady patience of a man who had long learned to live with silence. At night, when the storm winds pressed against the walls, Clara would curl by the fire, her knees tucked to her chest, her hands gripping the sack's edge as if it were a shield. Caleb, seated across the room, would watch the flames dance across her figure. He never intruded, but in the way his gaze softened, she could feel the quiet offering of safety he extended to her. Each meal he placed before her, every log he set upon the fire, was a wordless vow that she was no longer a possession to be auctioned, but a person worth waiting for. Healing, like a gentle stream, often begins in silence, and within those still moments something fragile began to bloom. One morning, the light spilling golden across the pines, Clara stirred before Caleb had risen. She moved about the cabin with tentative purpose, her bare feet making no sound upon the worn planks. She found the kettle, filled it with water from the bucket, and set it upon the stove. The steam rose slowly, curling like a promise. When Caleb opened his eyes to the sight, a strange warmth filled his chest. For the first time since his wife's laughter had vanished from these walls, someone else's hands had touched the rhythm of his mornings. Clara, sensing his gaze, drew back, her fingers tightening around the sack's knot. "I only wished to help," she murmured, her voice soft but steady. He nodded, no words needed, and the silence between them deepened, not with distance, but with something gentler, a tenderness that asked nothing yet gave everything. The days turned into weeks, and the forest itself seemed to bend closer to watch them. Clara began to step outside more often, carrying a pail of water to the river, gathering pine cones near the path, brushing her fingers over the ferns as if reminding herself the earth was real beneath her touch. Caleb's eyes followed her quietly, though he worked his axe with unrelenting force, each strike against the wood echoing the turmoil inside him. His wife's memory was a weight he carried still, yet Clara's presence stirred something alive, a pulse he had not felt in years. It frightened him, the way his chest ached when she hummed beneath her breath, the way his hands longed to reach for her when her figure moved gracefully against the light. One evening, as rain threatened and the clouds bruised the horizon, Caleb returned to find Clara stitching one of his torn shirts. Her fingers, though scarred, moved with delicate precision, guiding the needle through fabric as if she were weaving not just thread, but the fragments of her own broken past into something whole again. He watched her quietly, leaning against the doorway, his chest tightening at the sight. She had kept herself hidden behind that sack, yet here she was, bringing life back into the worn fabric of his days. She glanced up, sensing him, and though her eyes remained veiled, the curve of her mouth trembled into something close to a smile. Healing, he thought, sometimes comes not with grand declarations, but with the simple act of someone sitting beside you, mending the fabric of your life, stitch by stitch. Later, as the storm broke, Caleb found her by the river, kneeling with the bucket. The knot of the sack had loosened, and she tilted her head slightly, just enough for the water's reflection to catch a glimpse of her chin, the curve of her lips. She hummed then, a low, haunting tune that seemed to carry the scent of pine and the memory of snowbound nights. Caleb froze, the sound cutting through him like a blade. He knew that song. It was the same melody that had once guided him through a storm, sung by a woman whose hands had saved his life when death's shadow had loomed too near. His breath caught, his fists tightening as he fought the urge to call her name, to demand the truth. But instead he stepped closer, each beat of his heart louder than the rush of the river. Clara turned, startled, and the bucket slipped from her hands, spilling water across her dress. The thin cotton clung to her body, revealing the graceful curve of her form beneath the fading light. For a heartbeat, Caleb's resolve shattered. His eyes drawn to her, with a hunger he despised himself for feeling. His vow to his wife echoed in his mind, a chain pulling him back from the edge. Yet his body betrayed him, aching toward the woman before him. Her breath quickened, the sack fluttering as if the wind itself longed to tear it away. He reached out, his calloused hand brushing the curve of her neck just above the sack's hem, the warmth of her skin searing against his rough fingers. She gasped, a soft sound that sent fire through his veins, her body trembling beneath his touch. For one fragile moment, time bent, the world narrowing to the space between them. He leaned closer, his lips hovering near hers, their breaths mingling, the air thick with longing. Then a sharp crack split the night, a branch snapping in the pines, deliberate, too close. Caleb jerked back, his hand dropping, his desire collapsing into cold awareness. Clara stumbled, clutching the sack tighter around her face, her body retreating into its shield of fabric. The forest stilled, the river's song drowned by the distant thunder of hoofbeats. Caleb's hand found the knife at his belt, his body tensing with the instinct of a man who had lived too long with danger. And just as quickly as the moment had burned, it was gone, left behind in the trembling silence of the riverbank, in the echo of a song that still haunted his blood. Shadows gathered in the trees, bringing with them a new threat, a stranger whose arrival would unravel the fragile peace they had begun to weave. And though Caleb's heart still ached with the memory of the almost kiss, his gaze turned cold and sharp, because he knew in that instant that their lives were no longer alone, no longer safe. Someone was coming, and the past they both carried would not remain hidden much longer. The night after the hoofbeats faded left the cabin steeped in a silence heavier than before, as though the pines themselves held their breath. Caleb had barred the door, his knife laid close by, while Clara sat curled by the fire with the sack loose around her face, the flames dancing across the frayed edges. The storm outside rattled the shutters, and though danger had passed for the moment, the shadows lingered, pressing in with questions neither dared to speak aloud. Caleb's arm, grazed by the crack of Jasper's pistol, throbbed beneath the makeshift bandage, yet his eyes remained on her, watchful, unwilling to surrender his guard. Clara's fingers moved restlessly, twisting at the hem of her dress, pulling loose threads until they coiled into tiny knots. The firelight kissed her cheek where the sack slipped back, revealing a trace of the scar that marked her. She caught Caleb's gaze before quickly lowering her head, but the memory of that fleeting glimpse seared him. The ache of wanting to know her, fully without veils, gnawed at him. Yet he swallowed it down, for his heart still wore the vow of another, a ghost he could not bury. Days passed, but the air remained taut with unspoken words. Clara moved quietly about the cabin, repairing his shirt where the sleeve had torn, sweeping the floor with a branch broom she had crafted, humming softly when she thought he wasn't near. Caleb chopped wood with more force than was needed, each swing of his axe a struggle to bury the hunger she stirred in him. Yet in the evenings, when he returned, Her presence was the only warmth that reached deeper than the fire. It was in the way she lifted her head at the sound of his boots, the way she gently placed a bowl before him, that his chest tightened. Love did not announce itself in grand gestures. It seeped in, quiet as the forest rain, healing wounds neither dared name. One afternoon, the sky bruised with gathering clouds, Caleb found her kneeling by the hearth, brushing ashes into a wooden pan. The sack had slipped so far back he could see most of her face. The scar traced her cheek like a river carved through stone, not disfiguring but declaring survival. She froze when she realized his eyes had lingered, her hand darting to pull the fabric forward again. But Caleb stepped closer, his breath unsteady. "You don't need to hide here," he said quietly, the words rasping from his throat like something dragged from deep within. She stilled, her shoulders trembling. For a moment he thought she would retreat further, but instead she let the sack fall halfway, her eyes catching the glow of firelight. They were dark, filled with pain and defiance, but also with a tenderness that threatened to undo him. "I don't know who you think I am," Clara whispered, her voice sharp with fear. "But you don't know me." Caleb knelt before her, his rough hands resting against his knees, his gaze steady. "I don't need to," he answered, the weight of his words filling the small space between them. "Not yet." His chest ached as he said it, but something in her face softened, a flicker of trust kindled by the simple acceptance. For the first time since the auction, her shoulders eased, and though she pulled the sack back again, she did so more gently, as though she no longer feared he would rip it away. That night, as the storm broke, Caleb lay awake, listening to the river swelling outside, the sound of rain against the roof like 1,000 whispered prayers. Clara's breathing, steady beside the fire, lulled him into a place between waking and memory. He saw again the snow-bound cave, the glow of embers, the woman's hands feeding flames, while his body clung to life. Was it truly Clara? His heart screamed yes, but the weight of uncertainty kept him silent. When dawn came, the air carried the sweetness of pine washed clean by rain. Clara stepped outside, her sack fluttering as she bent to gather wildflowers, pushing stubbornly through the wet soil. She held them delicately, her scarred hands cradling their fragile stems as though she understood too well how something battered could still bloom. Caleb, watching from the doorway, felt the truth press hard against his chest. He was falling, despite every vow he had sworn. Later, by the river, she hummed again, the same haunting song that had once stitched his soul back together in the dark of winter. Her voice rose with the water's current, threading through the trees like a blessing. He stood in silence, torn open by memory and desire, every fibre of him reaching toward her. The sack fluttered in the breeze, her jawline catching light, her lips parted around the melody. He clenched his fists, torn between honor and the fierce longing to take her face in his hands and kiss away every shadow. But the forest betrayed them again. The sound of hoofbeats returned, closer this time, thundering through the pines with cruel certainty. Clara stiffened, the flowers slipping from her hands into the river's current. Caleb's pulse hammered as he drew his rifle, his body bracing against the weight of danger. Through the trees emerged Jasper Kane, his duster flapping, his gaze sharp and venomous. His smirk curled when it landed on Clara, lingering too long on her veiled face, her damp dress clinging to her curves. "Heard you got yourself a new wife, Holt?" Jasper sneered, his fingers brushing the pistol at his side. Caleb stepped forward, planting himself between them, his stance wide, shielding her with his body. His voice dropped to a growl, each word a stone flung with purpose. "Ain't your concern." But Jasper's smirk deepened, his eyes narrowing. "Might be," he said, venom threading his tone. "Talk's going round about a girl with a scar running from blood." Clara's hand trembled against Caleb's arm, her grip a fleeting anchor, her body taut with fear. Caleb's heart roared with fury, but beneath it was something else, something tender, protective, unshakable. The truth of her past was clawing free, and with it came danger, but also the chance to break the chains binding them both. Yet he held her steady, the warmth of her touch searing into his skin, and knew that no matter what shadows Jasper carried, he would not let her fall. The forest, the cabin, the very air around them seemed to brace for the storm that was about to break. And as Caleb faced Jasper with the rifle steady in his hands, Clara pressed closer, her breath sharp beneath the sack, her presence both a wound and a balm. Danger was no longer at the edges of their world. It had stepped directly into their path, and with it, the fragile bond they had begun to weave would be tested in fire and blood. The forest braced itself in the taut silence that followed Jasper's words, every pine needle trembling as if it too felt the weight of what had been unleashed. Caleb's rifle was steady in his hands, though his pulse thundered beneath the calm mask he wore. Clara pressed closer behind him, her fingers trembling against the fabric of his sleeve, her breath shallow beneath the burlap veil. The air itself felt charged, alive with the clash between past and present, danger and the fragile warmth that had only just begun to grow between them. Jasper's smirk widened, his boots grinding into the earth with lazy arrogance, as though he were already the master of this confrontation. His eyes burned with recognition, lingering on the faint outline of Clara's scar beneath the sack. "There are debts that never die," he murmured, his tone sharp as poison. "And scars don't hide what blood remembers." Caleb stepped forward, forcing Jasper's gaze off her and onto him. His stance was wide, unyielding, a wall of strength meant to shield her. "You'll take your debts elsewhere," he said, his voice low but final. Every word carried the heaviness of a man who had survived war, of someone who had no patience for cruelty. Jasper chuckled, dark and venomous, his hand brushing the hilt of his pistol with casual menace. "You can guard her, Holt, but you can't guard the truth." His gaze cut to Clara again, slicing through her like a blade. The sack shifted as she lowered her head, her grip on Caleb's arm tightening until her knuckles whitened. Caleb felt her trembling and turned slightly, just enough so she could feel his presence not only as a shield, but as an anchor. His arm flexed beneath her grasp, firm and steady, whispering without words, "You're not alone. Not anymore." It was a promise, small and healing, yet strong enough to tether her through the storm. The hoofbeats of Jasper's horse lingered faintly behind him, a reminder that the bounty hunter was never truly alone. The forest seemed to darken around them, the scent of pine mingling with the metallic edge of tension. Jasper tilted his head, studying Caleb with a predator's patience. "You think love will save her?" he asked, voice dripping with mockery. "Love never saves. Love betrays." "Ask her what she's running from." Clara's breath hitched audibly, a sound sharp enough to pierce Caleb's chest. He wanted to silence Jasper with a single pull of the trigger, but he also knew that words left unanswered could haunt more deeply than bullets. His voice rose, firm as stone. "Whatever she's running from, she's mine now. And you won't touch her." The words hung in the air, startling even Clara. She turned slightly toward him beneath the sack, her body trembling not with fear, but with something raw. Hope. A warmth bloomed in her chest, fragile and painful, like sunlight touching a scar that had only known shadow. For the first time since Missouri, since blood had stained her hands, she felt the stirrings of safety. Jasper's smile thinned into something sharp. He tipped his hat with mocking courtesy and stepped back into the shadow of the trees. "We'll see," he said, his voice curling through the pines like smoke. Then, with a flick of his reins, he vanished into the dark, leaving behind an echo of threat that clung to the branches long after he was gone. Caleb lowered the rifle slowly, though his body remained rigid. Clara sagged against him, the strength draining from her limbs now that the danger had passed. For a moment, neither spoke, the forest around them alive with the rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of the river. Then Caleb turned, his hands rough but careful as they brushed against her shoulders. "Back to the cabin," he said softly. His voice was less command than comfort, steadying her trembling steps. She nodded beneath the sack, too raw for words, and together they walked through the trail that wound between the trees. Each branch, clawing at their clothes, seemed a reminder that the world outside would never let them rest. Yet the steady rhythm of Caleb's stride was a balm, promising that he would carry what shadows came. Inside the cabin the fire was rekindled, filling the space with light that pushed back the darkness. Clara sat by the hearth, her body curled into itself, while Caleb cleaned the rifle and set it aside. The silence between them was no longer hollow. It was heavy with truths yet to be spoken. She knew she could not keep the past buried forever, not with Jasper's venom seeping into their fragile peace. Her fingers tightened on the hem of the sack. She thought of the man in Missouri, of the moment her hands had struck to survive, of the blood that had stained her forever. She thought of the way Jasper had looked at her, not as prey, but as memory, as vengeance. Her scar burned with the weight of it. But when she lifted her gaze toward Caleb, she saw not judgment, but a quiet, unyielding presence. His eyes met hers, steady as the earth, and though he said nothing, the warmth in his gaze wrapped around her like a healing salve. That night, while the storm whispered beyond the walls, Clara lay awake by the fire. She watched Caleb as he sat near the door, guarding the threshold like a sentinel, his silhouette cut by the glow of embers. She listened to the rhythm of his breath, steady and grounding, and for the first time in years the fear that had haunted her sleep eased. She allowed her eyes to close, not in vigilance, but in rest, trusting that he would keep the night at bay. And yet, as dawn crept through the trees, both of them knew that the peace could not last. Jasper had left shadows in his wake, and shadows always return. What had begun as a fragile shelter of silence was about to be tested by fire, and the truth, long hidden behind burlap and scars, would demand to be seen. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath for what was coming, as though the pines understood that love, once awakened, could never again be silenced. The cabin breathed in uneasy quiet after Jasper's shadow slipped into the trees, but the silence was not peace. It was heavy, pressing against the walls, filling every crevice with the knowledge that danger had not been banished, only delayed. Caleb sat near the fire, his rifle across his knees, his eyes fixed on the flames, though his thoughts churned elsewhere. Clara sat opposite him, her knees drawn close, the burlap sack slipping low against her neck. The firelight caught strands of dark hair spilling loose, brushing against her jaw as though daring to show the world what she so carefully concealed. For a long time, neither spoke. The river outside whispered, the forest stirred, and the wind tapped softly against the window as though urging confession. Caleb's jaw worked, his knuckles white against the rifle, but he said nothing. He knew she carried a past that burned like coals beneath her silence. He also knew that forcing words from her would break the fragile trust that had begun to form. And so he waited, steady as stone, his presence a quiet offering. Clara's fingers toyed with the knot of the sack. Her heart hammered against her ribs, torn between the safety of secrecy and the ache of release. Every moment with Caleb drew her closer to the edge, where silence no longer protected but suffocated. She closed her eyes, hearing Jasper's voice echoing in her skull. Ask her what she's running from. When she opened them, Caleb's gaze was steady on her, not demanding, only waiting. That quiet steadiness undid her more than anger or questions ever could. "I killed a man," she whispered, the words spilling into the fire's crackle, sharp and raw. The air seemed to still, even the flames bending toward her confession. Caleb's hands tightened on the rifle, but his eyes never wavered. Clara drew a trembling breath, her voice steadying as if, once begun, the truth would not stop. Back in Missouri. He tore my face, dragged me into the dark. I fought back. I didn't mean to end him, but I did. And since that night, I have carried his blood like chains around my soul. Her voice broke, but she pressed on, her fingers tugging the sack loose until it slipped halfway, revealing the scar etched across her cheek. Firelight kissed the jagged line, turning it from a mark of shame into something fierce, a testament carved into her very skin. Tears trembled in her eyes, though she did not let them fall. I have hidden behind this cloth, behind silence, because no one would see me as anything but a killer. Not even myself. Caleb's chest ached as he watched her. The scar did not repulse him. It struck him with the force of truth. He saw not a murderer, but a woman who had survived what should have destroyed her. His voice was low when it came, cracked with the weight of his own ghosts. "You fought to live," he said. "That don't make you a killer." Clara's breath shuddered at his words, as if he had handed her a lifeline she had not dared to hope for. But then she shook her head, the sack slipping back into place, a shield she could not yet abandon. "You don't know what it is to carry it," she whispered. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice rough. "I carried death through war, Clara. I buried friends by my own hands. I came home to a wife who no longer breathed. I know what it is to carry blood, but I also know what it is to keep breathing anyway. You ain't alone in this." The fire popped, sending sparks upward like tiny stars breaking free. Clara's hands trembled, but she met his eyes through the veil's frayed edge, and for the first time she let the silence between them feel less like a wall and more like a bridge. His words sank into her, not erasing the weight she bore, but softening it, spreading warmth where there had been only cold. Healing does not always arrive as a sudden miracle. Sometimes it is the steady voice that tells you your scars do not define you. Outside, thunder growled in the distance, rolling through the mountains like a warning. Caleb's head turned sharply, instincts sharpened by years of survival. The danger was not gone. Jasper's venom still lingered in the trees. But in that moment, as Clara's confession hung between them, it felt as though another kind of storm had passed, a storm of silence, of shame. She reached across the space between them, her fingers brushing his sleeve. It was a fragile touch, hesitant, yet filled with the courage of someone daring to trust again. Caleb covered her hand with his own, rough and scarred, and the contact was grounding, steady, a silent vow that whatever hunted her, he would face it beside her. The night stretched long, the fire burning low, but neither pulled away. The forest groaned with the weight of coming trials, yet inside the cabin there was a fragile sanctuary. Two souls bound by scars, no longer strangers, but companions walking the same shadowed path. And when dawn crept over the horizon, it carried with it no promise of safety, only the certainty that danger would return. But Clara's heart beat with a rhythm she had thought long lost, the fragile pulse of hope. And as she stood by the window, the sack loose in her hands, she felt for the first time in years that perhaps she could face what hunted her. Caleb's presence was proof enough that even in a world steeped in blood and loss, healing could take root, small and stubborn, like wildflowers breaking through stone. The day ahead would demand more of them than either yet knew. Shadows were gathering. Jasper's hunger for vengeance was not spent, and the fragile bond they had begun to weave in firelight would soon be tested in blood. Yet for now, as Clara turned to meet Caleb's steady gaze, her scar glowing in the morning light, it was enough to know she was no longer hiding alone. The storm that had been promised by thunder finally broke upon them, not only in the sky, but within the walls of the cabin. Jasper Kane returned as the pines groaned under wind, his shadow cutting through the doorframe when it splintered beneath his boot. Lightning flared outside, thunder rolling in the distance, but the sound of his pistol cocking was sharper than any storm. Caleb was already on his feet, rifle in hand, his body a wall between Clara and the intruder. The fire snapped violently, as though reflecting the battle about to ignite. "Hand her over," Jasper snarled, his eyes gleaming with a predator's hunger, "or I'll burn this place down with both of you in it." His gaze slid to Clara, lingering with venomous recognition, the sack slipping just enough for him to catch the scar's shadow. "So it's true," he hissed. "The girl who killed my brother hides behind burlap and mercy she never deserved." Clara's heart lurched, her breath caught in her throat. Caleb stood taller, his rifle leveled, his voice low and steady despite the heat in his chest. "You'll leave with nothing but your life if you turn now." But Jasper's grin only widened, the pistol rising to meet Caleb's warning. The shot came first from Jasper, a crack that split the room. Caleb staggered back, the bullet grazing his arm, blood blooming through his sleeve. Clara's cry filled the cabin, sharp and desperate, as she lunged to his side. Her hands tore fabric from her dress, pressing it against his wound, trembling but steady in their purpose. Caleb's teeth clenched, his breath ragged, yet his grip on the rifle did not falter. He shoved her back, not out of rejection, but to shield her as he returned fire. The bullet struck wood, splinters exploding, forcing Jasper to duck with a laugh that reeked of cruelty. "You can't save her, Holt," Jasper taunted, stepping forward. "She's marked in blood. She'll destroy you the way she destroyed him." His pistol swung toward Clara, and in that instant her fear broke into fire. She seized the iron poker from the hearth, its weight heavy but familiar in her scarred hands. With a cry born of survival and fury, she swung. The iron glanced across Jasper's shoulder, knocking him off balance, forcing him back. "Run!" Caleb barked, but Clara stood firm, her chest heaving, the sack slipping lower until her scar burned visible in the firelight. Jasper froze for a heartbeat, the sight striking him like recognition carved in stone. His eyes widened, rage twisting his face. "You!" he spat, venom dripping from the word. "You took my brother." Before Clara could reply, Caleb slammed into him, the two men crashing to the floor in a storm of fists and blood. The rifle clattered aside, the knife at Caleb's belt flashing as he pinned Jasper down. But Jasper's strength was fed by vengeance, his laughter cruel even as Caleb's blade pressed against his throat. "Ask her," Jasper rasped, blood at his lips. "Ask her what she did to him. Ask her why my brother died with her name on his breath." Clara's body trembled, her breath shattering as the past clawed through her chest. The fire roared beside her, the shadows painting the scar across her cheek as if it were a brand of guilt. She bent, her hands grasping the rifle, the weight of it too much yet necessary. She lifted it, the barrel shaking as her eyes met Caleb's. He was straining against Jasper, knife poised, his chest rising and falling in ragged fury. And then Jasper spoke the words that broke the air like glass. "He was my brother." His voice cracked with grief, masked as hatred. "And she murdered him." The rifle wavered in Clara's hands. Her scar burned, her body frozen between truth and denial. The memory of Missouri rushed back. The alley, the man's breath rancid in her ear, the tearing pain, the desperate strike that ended his life. She had never known his name, never asked. Now it rose like a ghost, binding her in chains once more. Caleb's eyes flicked to her, searching, pleading for truth, even as his strength held Jasper down. And in that fragile breath she spoke, her voice raw but steady. "I didn't lie. He attacked me. I fought to live." The storm outside howled, rain slamming against the cabin, thunder rolling like judgment from heaven. Caleb's grip faltered, not from weakness, but from the weight of choice. He could end Jasper's life with a single thrust, silence the venom forever. Yet in Clara's voice, in the raw tremor of her confession, he heard not a killer, but a woman who had been forced to survive. Jasper lunged, his hand clawing for his pistol, but Caleb's knife drove down, not into flesh, but through the sleeve of Jasper's coat, pinning his arm to the floor. Jasper cursed, writhing, but Caleb's strength held him fast. "Enough!" Caleb growled, his voice thunder itself. Clara dropped the rifle, her hands shaking, her breath ragged. She pressed a hand to Caleb's shoulder, grounding him, her presence anchoring his fury. He looked at her then, his eyes raw, seeing not the sack, not the scar, but the woman whose voice had once sung him back from death in a snowbound cave. The recognition burned clear. She was the same. She had always been the same. Jasper's curses filled the room, venom spilling, but they no longer held power. Caleb bound his wrists with the twine Clara once wore around her own. The predator had become the captive. Yet the words Jasper had thrown like daggers still hung in the air, unanswered, festering. The storm had not ended. It had only shifted inward into the fragile bond that bound them. Clara turned from Jasper's fury, her scar bare now in the firelight, no longer hidden. She looked at Caleb, her voice trembling but unbroken. "You see me now. Not a ghost, not a memory. Just me. Can you bear it?" Caleb reached for her hand, his rough palm closing over hers, steady and warm. "I see you," he said simply, his voice heavy with everything he could not yet name. "And I'm still here." The rain softened outside, the storm retreating. But within the cabin, the battle had carved something indelible. Blood had been spilled, secrets laid bare, yet amidst the ruin there was a new beginning stirring, fragile as the first light after night's darkest hour. Healing, like the pine that bends but does not break, had begun its slow work. But the world would not wait for them to mend. The whispers of the outpost, the weight of Jasper's claim, the truth of Clara's scar, these shadows still pressed at their door. And as dawn crept over the pines, Caleb and Clara stood together, scarred and trembling, yet no longer strangers bound by silence. They were two souls whose wounds had begun to intertwine, bracing for the next storm that would surely come. The days that followed bled into one another, the forest still whispering of danger, even as the air inside the cabin shifted with the tender weight of truths half-spoken. Jasper Kane was bound and delivered into the hands of Sheriff Amos Reed, his venomous voice silenced at last behind iron and law. Yet his words lingered like smoke, curling in the corners of Caleb's mind. Clara's scar, her confession, her trembling voice insisting she had fought only to live, those things pressed against him in every quiet moment. And though the danger of Jasper's hand was gone, the danger of doubt remained. The outpost buzzed with whispers when they returned with Jasper in tow. Rough men spat rumors into the dirt, women traded glances that sliced sharper than knives. Clara held the sack loose over her head, her scar hidden again, but she felt every word like stones hurled at her body. Caleb walked beside her, steady as a mountain, shielding her from their eyes with the breadth of his shoulders. Yet she knew she could not remain hidden forever. Secrets, once stirred, demand to breathe. It was Eleanor Tate, the cook from Clara's past, who stepped forward into the square. Her hands trembled, but her voice rang clear, cutting through the crowd like the strike of a bell. "She fought for her life," Eleanor declared, her eyes fixed on Clara, then sweeping to meet the sheriff's. "I was there. I saw what that man did to her. She bears no guilt but survival." The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. Clara's knees weakened, her heart thudding with disbelief. After years of carrying the burden alone, after hiding behind cloth and shadows, the truth now stood in daylight, spoken not only by her lips, but by another's. The warrant against her name lifted like fog burning off in morning sun. Her chest trembled with release, and tears slipped from beneath the sack, not of sorrow, but of something fragile, healing, freedom. Caleb's gaze never left her, his chest tight as he watched her shoulders shake. The burlap that had been her prison slipped from her hands, falling into the dust. The crowd gasped, but Clara no longer cared. The scar burned across her cheek, jagged and raw, but she lifted her chin, meeting their eyes with a strength born of survival. For the first time, she did not shrink beneath their gaze. She was not shame. She was proof that life could rise even from ruin. Caleb stepped closer, his hand brushing hers, warm and steady, the roughness of his palm grounding her as though anchoring her to the earth. He did not look at the scar with pity, nor with fear, but with a tenderness that stripped her bare in a different way. "You're no ghost," he said softly. His voice meant only for her. "You're flesh and blood, and stronger than any of them will ever understand." Her breath hitched, her lips parting as a small smile broke through, delicate as a spring flower pushing through snow. For so long she had hidden, waiting for the world to recoil. But in his eyes she saw no recoil, only acceptance, only the kind of love that makes scars beautiful because they tell the story of survival. Healing, she realized, was not about forgetting the wound, but about finding someone who traced it with reverence instead of disgust. The days that followed carried the rhythm of rebirth. The burlap sack did not return to her face. Instead, she stitched it into something new. With needle and thread, she embroidered it with purple flowers and a single pine sprig, her scarred fingers moving with patient grace. Each stitch was a prayer, each loop of thread a reclaiming of what once bound her. By the time it was finished, the cloth no longer spoke of shame, but of transformation. It had become her veil. Caleb watched her work, his heart aching with a strange, quiet joy. He saw how her shoulders no longer curled inward, how she met his eyes without flinching, how her smile lingered more often in the corners of her mouth. And when she placed the finished veil into his hands, her eyes shimmering with vulnerability, he understood what she was offering. Not fabric, not thread, but herself, entirely. They wed beneath the canopy of pines, the river singing in the distance, the air sweet with wildflowers. Clara's dress was simple, her scar bared beneath the embroidered veil, radiant not in spite of it, but because of it. Caleb stood beside her, his hand steady in hers, his eyes burning with the vow unspoken but unbreakable, that her shadows were now his, that her scars were threads woven into the fabric of their shared life. When the sheriff's words bound them in law, the forest seemed to sigh with relief, the wind carrying the blessing of ancient trees. Clara lifted her veil, her lips parting with trembling courage, and Caleb bent to meet them. The kiss was not desperate, not wild, but deep, steady, healing. It was the kiss of two souls who had walked through fire and found each other alive on the other side. After the vows, they planted a small pine beside the cabin, its roots pressing into the earth as their fingers pressed into each other's palms. The tree was a promise, tender and young, yet destined to grow strong through seasons of storm and sun. As Clara traced her hand along Caleb's rough knuckles, her scar catching the glow of twilight, she felt the world settle at last into something she could call her own. The forest still held shadows, and danger might come again, but for the first time she was not afraid. With Caleb's hand in hers, the path ahead no longer loomed as a threat, but beckoned as a horizon. Together, scarred yet whole, they stepped into a future that belonged to them. And in the warmth of his gaze, she understood. She had not only survived, she had been chosen, cherished, and healed by love itself. Spring bled into summer in the Oregon pines, and with it came a softer rhythm, one that hummed like a lullaby beneath the canopy of green. The cabin no longer felt like a refuge carved from grief. It had become a living thing, warm with laughter, quiet with the gentle routine of two souls who had learned how to breathe together. The days were filled with the scent of fresh-cut wood, the sweetness of bread Clara baked with careful hands, and the steady thud of Caleb's axe echoing through the forest like a heartbeat. Healing lingered in the air, subtle, persistent, like wildflowers blooming through soil once hardened by frost. Clara rose with the dawn, her veil of embroidered burlap hanging folded by the window, no longer a mask, but a symbol. She wore it when she chose, but more often she let the scar catch the morning light, her face lifted unafraid to the world. Caleb would watch her brush her hair by the hearth, the fire casting gold through the dark strands, and his chest would ache with a reverence so profound it silenced him. She was not a shadow. She was light itself, woven with threads of pain and survival, and to him she was more beautiful than any woman untouched by scars. They planted rows of herbs beside the cabin, their fingers digging into the earth side by side. The soil clung beneath their nails, grounding them, promising that roots, like hearts, could grow stronger after being torn apart. Clara hummed as she worked, her voice carrying the same haunting melody that had once kept Caleb alive in the cave. Now it was no longer a song of survival, but of belonging. Caleb would pause in his labor just to listen, the sound filling the air with something tender, healing, as if the forest itself bent closer to hear. Nights were no longer haunted, but alive with warmth. They would sit together on the porch as the stars burned sharp against the black, her head resting against his shoulder, his arm curved protectively around her waist. He would tell her of his wife, of the laughter that once filled these same walls. And Clara would listen, not with jealousy, but with a gentle acceptance that honored the love he had lost. In return, she shared pieces of her past, not as confessions weighted with shame, but as truths offered freely, stitched into the tapestry of their shared life. Each word spoken, each silence shared, wove them closer, binding scars into something whole. The pine tree they planted grew steadily by the cabin, its green needles shimmering under the sun, its roots drinking deep from the soil of second chances. Clara would kneel by it sometimes, her fingers brushing the fragile branches, whispering prayers of gratitude for the healing that had found her. Caleb would watch from the porch, his heart swelling with the quiet certainty that this woman, once bought for $2, once hidden beneath burlap, had become the center of his world. There were still whispers in the outpost, still eyes that lingered on her scar with judgment, but they no longer pierced her. She had learned that healing is not about erasing pain, but about carrying it with grace, about standing tall even when others expect you to bow. Caleb's hand in hers, steady and sure, was proof that she was no longer alone in the carrying. And when the murmurs rose, he silenced them not with violence, but with the unwavering truth in his gaze. She was his, and he was hers, and nothing the world could say would change that. Seasons would turn, storms would come, but the cabin had become their sanctuary, the place where two broken lives had found a way to mend. In the mornings, Clara would stir the pot of stew, setting 2 bowls on the table, not out of habit, but because love had finally given her a reason to share them. In the evenings, Caleb would rest his weary hands against hers, his roughness meeting her softness, and together they would watch the fire burn low, their silence filled with more than words could hold. And so their story unfolded, not as a tale of despair, but as one of redemption, where scars became symbols, where burdens became shared, where love, unexpected, stubborn, healing, grew wild among the Oregon pines. If this story touched your heart, if you felt the warmth of Clara's healing or the strength of Caleb's devotion, I invite you to let your voice join theirs. Leave a comment, share what stirred you most. Offer a like to keep this fire alive, and subscribe so that together we can continue weaving tales of love and redemption. Every gesture, no matter how small, helps these stories breathe, like drops of water to the roots of that young pine, growing stronger each day beneath the open sky.